And so our pastors chose what Bible passages they wanted to preach on each Sunday. The advantage of this approach is that the preacher can choose texts that they think are timely for the church. The disadvantage of this approach is that it is the preacher who is responsible for whether or not the texts are relevant. If I was preaching in the churches of my youth, I'm not sure I would have picked John 1 as our passage for this morning. If today was a typical day after New Year's, maybe Joshua 24, a reflection on the year past and a challenge to recommit ourselves to God in the year ahead. Or, given that we're entering the third year of the COVID-19 pandemic, perhaps Revelation 21 would be better. A meditation on the new heavens and the new earth to come, where there is no more death or mourning or crying or pain. But today's reading was not chosen by me. It was set years ago by the lectionary, the standard Anglican calendar of readings. As this Sunday approached, I was quite apprehensive about what, if anything, this reading had to say to us. But once I was patient with the passage, I discovered several insights and a possible application to our strange time, which I hope might resonate with you as well. And if not, well, I didn't pick the text. Also, I'll be referring to certain verses as I go along. So if you want to do likewise, please open your physical Bible or Bible app to John 1. Last week, we heard the first words of John, in the beginning. These words are familiar. The first words of Genesis, the first book of the Hebrew and Christian Bibles, are the same in English, in the beginning. The book of Genesis then goes on to describe the creation of the world, including human beings. My favorite interpretations of Genesis emphasize how the text is in a dialogue with other ancient Near Eastern religions. Many religions had gods associated with the sky, earth, sun, water. Genesis says these are not gods, but good things that the one true God creates. Many religions had idol images in their temples to represent a god or king or god king that everyone was supposed to worship. Genesis says all human beings are created in the image of God, not just the priests or kings who rule the rest. This was an explicit challenge to the politics and religious systems of the ancient world, and a profound ascription of dignity to all humanity. The author of John chooses to start his gospel the same way as the book of Genesis, which means that we can and should look for similarities. The first verses of each discuss creation, darkness, and light, and you could write a whole book on that. But today's reading begins a little later at John chapter 1, verse 10. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. The Greek word we translate as world is cosmos. When I hear cosmos, I think of the physical universe. But in John, the world represents a combination of people, societies, and systems. We do this too, such as when people talk about the free world. Yet while Westerners typically think of the free world as a good thing, for John, the world has a problem. The world did not recognize the Word, who was God, the Father's only Son, Jesus. Thus, while the story of Genesis begins serenely in a state of harmony, John's gospel describes the world as ignorant of its true light. The next verse continues foreshadowing. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. We're only 11 verses into the story of Jesus. We haven't even heard his name yet. And there are warnings of conflict, rejection, failure. Rather than trying to avoid spoilers, John is cautioning the listener that this story will not be easy or simple. The world will not know Jesus, and his own Jewish people will refuse him, someone full of grace and truth. That's not a compliment to the world or to Israel. Thus, like Genesis, John's gospel has a critical edge. Then in verse 12, John starts to reassure his audience. He says, all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God. The first hearers of John were Christians, like us today. But unlike us, they were a tiny sect, barely distinct from other forms of Judaism, which was itself a minority religion struggling to survive the overwhelming hegemony of the Roman Empire. John is telling these first few followers of Jesus that unlike the world and unlike Israel, they have received Jesus, and as a result, they have been given power to become children of God. But what does becoming children of God mean? Verse 13 is a bit mysterious. It says, these children were born, not of blood, or of the will of the flesh, or of the will of man, but of God. Let's look at this verse in detail. First, born not of blood. Is anyone else familiar with the saying, God has no grandchildren? It means that your status as a child of God does not depend on who your parents are or what they believe. You could have descended from a long line of missionaries or be the first person in 12 generations of your family to follow Jesus. There's no difference before God. Similarly, this verse is critiquing the idea that you need to be a descendant of Abraham to be part of the people of God. With Jesus, anyone can become a child of God. Jews and Gentiles, Greeks and Romans, Egyptians and Ethiopians, Medes and Parthians, all are welcome, as we see throughout the New Testament, and especially in the book of Acts. However, John is critiquing more than just ethnic exclusivism. Verse 13 goes on to specify that these children of God are not born of the will of the flesh or the will of man either. Another translation is of human decision or a husband's will. This sounds a bit like adoption, which was uncommon in ancient Judaism, but quite common in Roman culture. Specifically, in Rome, it was routine for upper-class families to adopt. The male head of the household decided when to adopt and whom to adopt, and adoptees could be quite old. For example, Augustus Caesar adopted his stepson Tiberius when he was at the ripe age of 46. The emperor did this to appoint Tiberius as his successor and exclude his biological children from becoming emperor. And with the precedent set, many other emperors and senators continued the practice of choosing their successors through adoption. Why does this Roman history matter? Because I think John is making a point that our adoption as children of God is not like Roman adoption, where a fortunate few are chosen to advance the political and financial interests of the emperors and senators. Rather, as verse 16 says, from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. Or as the book of Ephesians explains, God chose us for adoption before the foundation of the world. Our adoption by God is a gift of grace and is for everyone born of God, not just those of a certain race or chosen by certain men. Fair enough, you may say, but what does this have to say to our world today? We in the free world believe that all human beings have dignity. We don't think anyone's race or parents should determine their status. And we live in a society where people earn their worth through merit, not the arbitrary choices of men, right? I think one of the basic questions of our age is self-worth. Traditionally on New Year's Day, people set New Year's resolutions, goals to improve themselves. Maybe we're going to eat better, exercise more, or spend less time on social media, or adopt some kind of productivity routine. If we work hard at developing those habits, we'll become better people happier, healthier, more successful, more worthy. Or maybe if we're careful enough, if we take enough personal responsibility, we won't get COVID and we'll finally bring this pandemic to a close. Well, I practice personal responsibility and I got COVID. Don't worry, I'm doubly vaccinated. My case is very mild and I'll be fine. But it's hard for me not to feel ashamed. Should have tried harder to get a booster shot earlier. I should have ordered N95 masks 2 months ago. I shouldn't have entered a restaurant with indoor dining to pick up takeout. Who knows? In any case, I'm realizing that an ethos of personal responsibility comes with a high cost. It means you feel personally responsible for everything that happens. And making smarter New Year's resolutions or installing some new diet app won't fix that. Eventually, you will fail. And if your self-worth is based upon how good you are at being human, then it'll crash too. So as we begin 2022, let's go back to the beginning. In the beginning was the Word. All things came into being through the Word. Light, darkness, sky, waters, land, plants, and fish and birds and every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. And it was good. And then God said, let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness. And that was very good. And then the Word became flesh and lived among us, moving into the neighborhood. And to all who received him, he gave power to become children of God. And from his fullness, we have all received grace upon grace. It's about grace, a solid foundation for our self-worth, maybe a good motto for 2022. Happy New Year.